the overnight train from Winnipeg to Thunder Bay didn't stop for anyone. That was the first thing Constance Rail learned when she hired on as a Via Rail attendant 12 years ago. A senior conductor named Bev, something had told her on her first shift, half joking, half warning. The train doesn't stop. You solve your problems on board, or you don't solve them at all. Constance had laughed at the time. She was 22, fresh out of a life she didn't talk about, and the idea of an unsolvable problem felt abstract and far away. She wasn't laughing now. Outside the windows of Car 7, the boreal forest slid past in absolute darkness. It was 2:14 in the morning, and most of the 60-odd passengers in the sleeper cars were tucked behind curtains, rocking gently with the motion of the train. The dining car had been closed for 3 hours. The lounge was empty except for the hum of the refrigeration unit and the low amber glow of the safety lighting along the floor. Constance moved through the narrow corridor of Car 6 with the quiet efficiency that had made her essentially invisible over a decade of this work. Trim build, dark hair pulled back, the standard navy Via Rail vest worn over a white shirt. Passengers never really looked at her. They looked past her, or through her, reaching for their drinks or their pillows or their complaints about the Wi-Fi signal. She had spent 12 years becoming someone people forgot the moment she left the room, and she was very good at it. What she was also very good at, though no one on this train knew it and she preferred it that way, was threat assessment. She had clocked the man in compartment 6 of Car 6 at the boarding gate in Winnipeg 3 hours ago. He'd presented a ticket for a private spur under the name Thomas Greaves. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, a doctor's coat folded carefully over one arm. Pleasant face, practiced smile. The kind of man who had learned to be forgettable in a different way than Constance had. Not by fading into the background, but by being so reassuringly ordinary that the eye slid right off him. She had watched him navigate the platform, the way he moved, the economy of it, the way his eyes tracked exits before they tracked people. She knew that walk. She'd had to unlearn it herself. There was a woman in Sleeper B of Car 7. Her name on the passenger manifest was Judith Pallister. She was 61 years old, traveling alone, and she had boarded in Winnipeg with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told, very specifically, to keep her head down. She'd taken her meal in her compartment. She'd closed her curtain early. When Constance had knocked at 9 o'clock to offer turn-down service, Judith had opened the door only a crack, and Constance had seen the exhaustion behind her eyes. Not the ordinary exhaustion of travel, but something older and heavier, the kind that came from being afraid for a long time. Constance had brought her a cup of chamomile tea and said nothing about it, but she'd noted it. She noted everything. The manifest told her that Judith Pallister was a retired schoolteacher from Brandon, Manitoba, traveling to see her daughter in Thunder Bay. The manifest didn't tell her about the 2 federal marshals who had met the train at the platform. Plain clothes, the subtle bulge of a sidearm under the left arm of the shorter one, and then stepped back at the last moment and not boarded. She had seen them speak into earpieces. She had seen one of them look directly at Car 7 and then look away. She had been thinking about that for 3 hours. Now she was thinking about Thomas Greaves, who had ordered a coffee from the lounge at 2 a.m. and hadn't come back to his compartment. The galley at the end of Car 5 was a narrow strip of stainless steel and overhead storage, lit by a single fluorescent tube. Constance topped up the carafe, mostly for something to do with her hands, and thought. Judith Pallister. She'd looked her up, discreetly, on the crew tablet they used for passenger information, and found nothing remarkable. A retired teacher, a grandmother of 4, former chair of the Brandon School Board. Nothing that explained federal marshals on a platform, except Constance had a memory like a trap. It was one of the things she'd never been able to fully switch off. She had stood in that Winnipeg platform and watched those 2 men in plain clothes and thought, I have seen that posture before. Not the posture of regular law enforcement. The posture of people running a protection detail who had just been told the detail was canceled. She had flagged it, mentally, stored it away, waited. And then Thomas Greaves had walked past her in the corridor at 2:08 in the morning, heading toward Car 7. And she had noticed 3 things in the 2 seconds it took him to pass. He was wearing a different shirt than he'd boarded in. He was carrying something in his right jacket pocket that weighted the fabric wrong, and he had not glanced at her once. People always glanced at the attendant. It was reflexive. Thomas Greaves had not been reflexive. She set down the carafe. She thought about the radio clipped to her belt, and the train's conductor, Neil Photo, who was almost certainly asleep in the crew car at the front of the train. She thought about the emergency line to Via Rail operations in Ottawa, which would patch her through to the RCMP, who would then have to locate the nearest detachment and figure out whether a moving train in the middle of northwestern Ontario at 2 a.m. fell under federal or provincial jurisdiction. She thought about what Thomas Greaves could do to Judith Pallister in the time it would take any of that to happen. She took her radio off her belt and pressed the call button. "Neil," she said quietly. "It's Constance. I need you to lock the cab and initiate emergency contact with the Ottawa Ops line. Right now. Don't ask me questions. Just do it." A pause. Then Photo's voice, groggy and confused. "Connie, what?" "Now, Neil." She was already moving. "And don't let anyone into the crew car. Anyone at all." She clipped the radio back to her belt and walked toward Car 7. The corridor of Car 7 was empty. The safety lights ran along the base of the wall in both directions, amber and steady. Constance moved through it quietly, the way she always moved. Weight forward, heel-toe, the old habits that her body remembered even when she told them to stand down. She stopped outside compartment B. The door was closed. The curtain was drawn. From inside, she could hear nothing, which was not necessarily reassuring. The sound dampening on these sleeper compartments was good enough to muffle most conversation. She stood for a moment and listened to the train, the rhythm of the wheels on the track, the low vibration in the walls. Then she heard something that didn't belong to any of it, a sound that was almost a word, quickly suppressed. She knocked. 2 quick raps, service style. "Housekeeping, Miss Pallister." "Just checking in." Silence. She knocked again. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to disturb you. I need to do a brief safety check of all sleeper compartments. Company policy for overnight travel." She kept her voice warm, unhurried. The voice she used for passengers who were nervous or confused. "It'll just take a moment." 3 seconds. 4. Then the door slid open. Thomas Greaves was standing inside compartment B with one hand on the door and his other arm around Judith Pallister's shoulders, in a posture that was designed to look protective and looked like anything but. Judith's face was very still, the way faces got when people were concentrating very hard on not showing fear. Greaves looked at Constance. His eyes made the instant calculation that eyes like his always made. Female, small, uniform, service staff, not a threat. "She's not feeling well," he said pleasantly. "Old friend of mine. I'm a doctor. Just checking on her." "Of course," Constance said. She kept her expression at the same level of warm professional concern she'd had knocking on the door. "Can I get anything for her? We have a first aid kit in the crew compartment." No. She just needs rest." He began to close the door. "Mrs. Pallister." Constance's voice didn't change in volume or tone. "Did you know that Via Rail trains have a secure passenger line directly to the RCMP? It's a safety measure on all overnight routes. Most people don't know about it." She met Judith's eyes. "I was just on it." A beat. Something moved across Greaves's face. Not much, just enough. "Well," he said. "That's reassuring." He stepped back, not out of the doorway, just back into the compartment, pulling Judith with him. His right hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Constance had been counting on the fact that a narrow train corridor was one of the worst places in the world to draw a weapon on someone who knew what they were doing and was already 3 feet away. She had also been counting on the fact that Thomas Greaves had decided she wasn't worth worrying about, and that he hadn't reevaluated that in time. What happened next was very fast and not particularly graceful. She caught his wrist with both hands before the gun cleared his pocket, turned her body into his, and used the wall of the compartment to do the rest. The weapon, a Glock, compact, suppressor-threaded, hit the floor. Greaves hit the floor a second later, face down, and Constance's knee was in the small of his back before he'd finished processing the fall. "Miss Pallister," she said with the same unhurried calm, "there are zip ties in the emergency kit in the overhead storage on your left. Can you reach those for me?" Judith Pallister stared at her, Then she reached up and opened the overhead storage. The RCMP met the train at the Sioux Lookout stop, the first scheduled pause on the line. Two cruisers and a federal officer who introduced himself as Inspector Raymond Aldcroft. She recognized the name from a news cycle 18 months ago, a case she'd followed for reasons she kept to herself. She had found out, in the 4 hours between Compartment B and Sioux Lookout, who Judith Pallister actually was. Not a retired schoolteacher, or not only that. The woman had sat across from Constance in the empty dining car, both of them drinking bad coffee, and told her, in the measured voice of someone who had made peace with a difficult truth, that she had spent 3 years as a bookkeeper for a man named Franklin Doyle. A name that Constance recognized immediately because Franklin Doyle's money laundering operation had been the subject of a federal investigation that had, 6 weeks ago, resulted in indictments, and Judith Pallister was the Crown's primary witness. "They canceled my protection detail 2 days ago," Judith said. She held her coffee cup with both hands. "Someone told me it was a budget issue, a scheduling conflict." She looked at Constance. "I didn't really believe that." "No," Constance said. "You shouldn't have." Judith looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Who are you, really? You moved like—" "I don't know how you moved. You moved like my son-in-law when he came back from—" She stopped. "He was in the JTF too. You know what that is?" Constance knew what it was. "The Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Special Operations Unit, based out of Petawawa. The kind of unit that, when people who had been part of it eventually left, sometimes found jobs that kept them close to exits and away from attention." "I'm a Via Rail attendant," Constance said. "I've been one for 12 years. It was true." It was also not all of the truth, and Judith Pallister, who had spent 3 years watching a man lie to her face while she helped him move money through shell companies, understood the difference. She didn't push. Inspector Aldcroft was professional and slightly baffled. He had a restrained way of asking questions that Constance recognized as the technique of someone who was very good at his job and was trying to figure out why the answers he was getting didn't fit the categories he'd been trained to put them in. "You're an attendant." He was looking at the written incident report she'd handed him. She'd had 4 hours to write it, and it was thorough because old habits. "And you disarmed a former CSIS contractor." "I disarmed a man who pulled a weapon in a sleeper compartment," she said. "Thomas Greaves worked for CSIS for 11 years. That explains some things about the way he moved." Aldcroft looked at her. He was in his mid-40s, the kind of face that had earned its lines honestly. He had, she noticed, the same quality she cultivated in herself, a way of going very still when he was thinking. "Ms. Rail, Constance, is there anything in your background that I should know about for this report?" "I have a clean record," she said. "You can check." "I did check." He set the report down. "No criminal record. Tax compliant. Employment history with Via Rail going back 12 years. There you go. Before Via Rail, I traveled," she said. "Did some contract work. Nothing that would be interesting to you." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he nodded, very slightly, and wrote something in his notebook. She didn't try to read it. Outside, through the windows of the dining car, the first gray light of morning was beginning to find the tree line. The spruce and birch of northwestern Ontario came slowly visible in it, enormous and close and indifferent. The train sat still on the tracks. The first time it had been still all night, and in the stillness Constance could feel how tired she was. Not the bone tired of a long shift, but something else. The specific exhaustion of having been a particular version of yourself, the version she kept locked away for several hours, and now having to put it back. Judith was in a rear compartment now, with 2 RCMPs she actually trusted, waiting to be transferred to a secure location. Greaves was in the hands of federal custody, and whatever he'd been contracted to do had ended on the floor of a sleeper compartment in the dark, somewhere west of Sioux Lookout, because he'd looked at the woman taking care of his compartment and decided she wasn't worth being careful around. Constance had been underestimated her entire adult life. She had worked very hard to make sure of it. She found Neil Photo in the conductor's cab at the front of the train, sitting with his hands wrapped around a thermal mug and the look of a man who had spent the last 4 hours following instructions he didn't understand and was choosing to believe that this was probably fine. "Everyone okay?" he said. "Everyone's okay." He nodded. He was a practical man, Neil. She had worked with him for 6 years, and she liked him for exactly this quality, the way he dealt with things as they were rather than as he expected them to be. "I made the call like you said. Ottawa Ops patched through to the RCMP. I know. Good call, Connie." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. "What was that?" She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down for the first time in 4 hours. "A passenger who needed help," she said. "And the wrong man in the wrong compartment." "That's it. That's it." He studied her for a long moment. In 12 years, she knew, Neil had noticed things about her. Not the right things, not the things that mattered, but enough to build a picture that didn't quite fit the frame of train attendant. Unremarkable, 12-year tenure. He'd never asked. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. "Okay," he said. "You want a coffee?" "God, yes." He poured. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked out the front windshield of the cab, at the track running straight and unwavering into the morning. The forest on both sides, the sky going pale in the east. In 2 hours, they'd be in Thunder Bay. She'd help the passengers off, reset the compartments, file the rest of her paperwork. Judith Pallister would be somewhere safe, which was more than she'd been 12 hours ago. Thomas Greaves would be answering questions he hadn't planned on answering. And Franklin Doyle's operation, which had apparently survived an indictment well enough to contract someone to eliminate a witness, would have to try a different approach. Constance drank her coffee. She thought about calling her sister in Calgary, who she hadn't spoken to in 3 weeks. She thought about the library book in her bag that she'd been meaning to finish for a month. She thought about whether the cafe near the Via Rail depot in Thunder Bay was still doing that particular dark roast she liked, the one from the small operation in the Laurentians. She thought about Judith Pallister's face when she'd said, "You moved like my son-in-law," when he came back. The way she'd looked at Constance, not with fear and not quite with surprise. Something in between. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of someone who had learned to see past the surface of things 3 years too late in her own life. Constance had seen it in time. That was the job, whether anyone knew what the job actually was or not. The train began to move again. The rhythm came back, the track, the wheels, the steady rocking that she had spent 12 years learning to sleep through and now couldn't sleep through anymore, and had stopped trying. She settled into it. The boreal forest opened around them, vast and quiet and lit with the particular pale gold of a northern Ontario morning, and the overnight train from Winnipeg to Thunder Bay didn't stop for anyone. It didn't need to. The right person was already on board.